I'm admitting Johanna. And Melissa, I don't see the recording notation. There it is now. Okay, great. It is Thursday, April 1st, 2020. This is a meeting of the Steering Committee of the Vermont Climate Council. Did I say 2020? It's April 1st, 2021. Yes, let's get that past year behind us. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, guests. We have an agenda today that takes us through 3 o'clock. We'll have a hard stop at 3 out of respect for folks' schedules and their next meetings. We have the agenda that covers approving a number of weeks of minutes, talking about the technical services RFP, subcommittee leads for overlapping issues, and the draft outline of the climate action plan and member matters. And then a public comment with adjournment. The meeting will be facilitated by David Plum from Consensus Building Institute. And if there's any comment on the agenda as proposed, we can take that now. And
great. Thanks, Secretary Young. Any questions on what we're trying to do in this hour? Okay. Great. And just as a matter of good practice, my recommendation is if you're not a member of the steering committee, I'd ask you to keep your camera off until the public comment period. It's just helping us stay focused. And thanks so much. And we'll also use the chat during that public comment period as well. Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Let's dive into it. If there's no questions on the agenda. First thing is those 3 sets of minutes. Any questions or concerns or comments on those 3 sets of minutes that are linked into the agenda? Anything people want to do with those? Great. I see thumbs up. I see okay. Okay. Thanks for all the thumbs up. We'll take those as approved with no objection. Thanks so much. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is Jane's going to walk us through where we're at with the technical services RFP. This is advancing nicely, and Jane, why don't you just talk about where we're at? Let's not get bogged down in this, folks. Let's just spend 5-10 minutes on this. These conversations are happening in the subcommittees as well, but this is good for us as a steering committee. Just make sure we're all on the same page of where things are at. So Jane, I'll turn it over to you for that, please.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so one of the things I want to highlight for this conversation is a recognition that at the full council meeting, when we presented a process for moving forward with the RFP and advancing it, we had intended to prepare and illustrate a final RFP to the steering committee on today, and we're not quite there yet. So I wanted to articulate what we have done to date and then clearly set up a process for the next week to get us across the finish line. And so the RFP has been informed by a lot of assistance through the Science and Data Committee, specifically Jared Duvall, steering committee member, as well as TJ Poor in guiding our understanding and comprehension of what we learned through the RFI responses, the 15 of those, and then to put forward the technical services needed in light of the decision that was made at the council meeting to consider and appreciate and recognize the incorporation of the work that the Comprehensive Energy Plan already has underway with respect to the development of the LEAP model. So we have there was a memo prepared by Jared, took the lead on with TJ and I's input that was shared with the Science and Data Committee, as well as the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee and Ag and Ecosystems, who have particular components of interest with respect to the technical analysis contract last week. I took feedback that I got on that memo and drafted the RFP that has since circulated to all of the subcommittees now. And that was first and foremost sent to the Science and Data Committee earlier. And then last night, having met with the Science and Data Committee yesterday during the day, I incorporated all of the feedback that I heard from Science and Data Committee members into a revised draft that has now gone out to the other subcommittees, with the expectation and understanding that really the 2 subcommittees that will weigh in at this point are really limited to cross-sector mitigation and ag and ecosystems. So I'm hopeful, having just met with cross-sector mitigation just before this meeting, that we're pretty close on a final RFP. And my understanding and expectation is that with the input and help final sort of comments by some particular staff on the cross-sector mitigation, as well as the Ag and Ecosystems subcommittee meeting on Friday, that by Monday of next week, we'll have a final RFP that will go out one more time to the Science and Data Subcommittee next week for their approval, as well as any final thoughts or comments from the other subcommittee members. But our expectation is then to put out the RFP by the end of next week, which still sort of tees us up for roughly having these technical services available to the council's work sometime in early May. So that's our hope and understanding. That RFP was shared with all of you last night as well, and is provided for on the website right now for comments or consideration through the subcommittee work. And I'll just sort of leave it at that as a recommended approach at this point and ask if that feels appropriate or if there's other check-ins that are needed with this group in particular.
Thanks, Jane. Great. Thoughts? I see 2 hands and I don't know the order, or 3 hands. Hang on just a second, see if I can get the order on that straight.
Chris was first.
Go ahead, Chris, please.
So something I brought up a couple times, and I would just encourage you to pursue it in the RFP, and I emailed briefly Ann Margolis back and forth about this. Each of the regional planning commissions develop comprehensive energy plans to implement the to implement the state comprehensive energy plan, and all the modeling that we developed, it was a sector by sector approach, and it addressed greenhouse gas emission reduction, fuel switching, and also renewable energy generation. And collectively, the regional plans were to basically help implement the state comprehensive energy plan. And what I suggested at the last climate council call was potentially having these consultants also review collectively those plans and see what collectively the strategies were to actually implement the CEP on a sub-state region by region basis, because it might actually help us get some distance on strategies to actually implement to achieve the council's goals. And so, Ann Margolis worked with the RPCs. We all had to follow the same set standards that were required under Act 174. The Department of Public Service developed the standards along with ANR. And it just seems like that would be a good use of time and might help jumpstart a lot of our conversation. All this was publicly vetted. It was about a 2-year process for each of the plans. It just seems to make sense to me that it would be a useful tool.
Thanks, Chris. Just as a quick aside, have folks talked about that? And is there any sort of feedback to Chris about how those conversations have happened?
There has not been any discussion, to my knowledge, on that.
All right, Secretary Young.
I'll defer to Lauren.
Okay, Lauren, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to thank you, Jane, for that overview. And having just come from cross-sector mitigation, where I kind of heard how that process was relayed and there was opportunity for a conversation around the intricacies and technical scope pieces of that RFP, I appreciate the process as laid out and the opportunity for those more relevant subcommittees to have an opportunity to weigh in. So understanding that Ag and Ecosystems meets tomorrow, cross-sector mitigation might have a little bit of tweaking based on the conversation today. I think getting this through next week as Jane presents is that's fine by me, and I appreciate the process.
Super. Thanks, Lauren. Secretary Young.
Yes, thank you. I always have to, go back to my role ex officio as the Secretary of Administration and looking at these things. And we have a pretty rigorous request for proposal and contracting process. And as I look at this, I don't see a lot of the, required attachments and language, and I'm sure that will come. I guess my first question is, this is something that is going to lead to a contract, correct?
Yeah, yes, and all those, yes, and I'll just comment that I just
Okay.
stripped those attachments from like the way that felt like more of an internal recognition of how the state does business and not where input was required, because they don't need to be changed.
I'm not sure I understood. I'm sorry.
Well,
Okay. I haven't had a chance to really plow through it. But the thing that really concerns me, I just looking at it is, you know, that and it's a comment in the side margin about, do we put a budget, or do we put how much we have budgeted for this in the RFP? I think the whole point of the request for proposals is not to tell them how much we have to spend, but to tell them we have a job that needs to be done and we would like their best price. And what are they proposing to do this work for, you know, with a contract? What are they going to charge us, not how much we can spend? So that concerns me, that we would put out, you know, we wouldn't put something out that's very clear. You're sending us a cost proposal. You're not sending us a budget, and we're not going to tell you how much we have funded. So I just want to make sure this is run through, you know, whoever, you know, at A&R perhaps does your contracting work, and I'll defer to Secretary Moore.
Yeah, and we've been working both with Megan O'Toole as part of our legal services team, and then also with Emily Byrne as the CFO, to make sure that we get all of those important contracting boxes checked.
Great, good, because this will eventually find its way up to the Secretary's office,
right,
and beyond. So it is a process, you know. So the contract that results from this will find its way up. So we want to make sure we've laid a good framework and the required foundation for that, whatever contract evolves from this. So thank you.
Thanks. And so the clear message there, you know, from you, Secretary Young, is don't put a dollar value in there. Let them come back.
Yeah. I will say I think where that came from, just to explain that, is we had a budgeted amount for both facilitation and outreach and education. And so when proposals were being put forward, people asked us that, and I was working off of those, saw that and know that what we have budgeted, but have no idea what this will cost. And so I want it to come through cost proposals that people put forward to us and don't want to put it in, and wanted to make sure it was okay to delete that portion.
Yeah, perfect. And what you do is, you know, as part of your review of the RFP, you'll be looking at the cost and other items, you know, that you deem important ahead of time. And that, again, just a flag, because not everybody, you know, lives in this world of state contracting, is if you are going to have, you know, a review process, you have to be very careful with the documents, who's reviewing them, you know, and protect the integrity of the bid process, so that no particular proposal, you know, has any, you know, insight into other proposals. So it's kind of like, too, I think, a conflict check as well. So I would have no idea who would come forward with a proposal. I'm just saying, let's be careful, make sure we follow those rules. But otherwise, you know, I'm glad we're this far along.
Yeah, great. Any other comments on this before we move on to the next piece? Anything else for Jane on this? Welcome, Liz. Good to see you. Okay.
Can I just ask,
Chris, last comment?
Yeah, just a quick, Jared, my comment about the review and assessment of the regional energy plans and the strategies contained within. I mean, I think you were at VEIC when we were working with that and helping with developing, with using the data and all of that. Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I would. So I wasn't at VEIC, I was with EAN, but working with VEIC on the LEAP model, and then we were providing out the data to the RPCs to help inform those regional plans. I do think that there's some good information in there. One thing that I think is a potential limitation is that, you know, they were primarily directed to meet the renewable energy goals and energy efficiency goals of the comprehensive energy plan. of course, there are emissions reduction goals in the comprehensive energy plan, but one of them was not this first requirement around 2025 that the Global Warming Solutions Act is organized around. And as we've looked at this RFP, we've been trying to make sure that we end up with an actionable plan in terms of strategies that can move forward to meet that 2025 requirement. And because both because the emissions reduction goal in the CEP seemed to be kind of subsumed under some of the other goals, and because there wasn't an emissions reduction target before 2030, my read, and you would know this better than I do, Chris, but my read is that a number of those regional plans don't really address emissions reduction on the timescale that we really need to be focusing on in this climate action plan, i.e. by 2025. It's not to say there isn't good material in there that shouldn't, I think there is some good material that should be considered, but I don't think it's kind of a cut and paste or a one-to-one kind of alignment.
Well, no, and that's the thing. I'm not suggesting that, but we break it out we break it out by sector in the reads about what the current energy consumption is. And that's my concern, is that I think that would give more detailed information about achieving those 2025 strategies.
So can I just interrupt for 1 second to say, this sounds like something that Chris, you and Jared might want a separate conversation about. And so I think, particularly Jane, if you're not entirely clear which way to jump with this one, maybe you can organize a call on that, because this seems like worthy of additional conversation we don't have time for right now, if that's okay with folks. Because I think this seems like there's something there, there's some there, and we need to tease that out a little bit more.
Bless Jane's heart.
Okay.
Sorry, Jane.
All right, folks, let's pivot to our next piece. And this is coming straight out of a request from the last council meeting, where we recognize there are overlapping areas, and we thought it would be important to name them more clearly and name a lead subcommittee that really has the responsibility of running with that, even as other subcommittees can weigh in and provide some input, but creating a lead. So Jane, you've got a list. It's also hyperlinked into the agenda. And I will say, for anybody observing, there is an agenda online. Maybe Melissa or somebody could drop it in the chat. And that agenda has hyperlinks to the documents we'll be looking at now. So Jane, do you want to open that up or share your screen or do something? I'm happy to share my screen too, if you want me to.
If you have it open, I was 110% that I had it open, but I'm not seeing it when I look at my share.
I'll share my screen. Just give me 1 second. I'll be right there.
Well, let me just state that this came up through dialogue and discourse at the last council meeting, as David alluded to. And I think as we embark on the substantive work of the subcommittees, it was well worth the effort that everybody put in last week to sort of having some cross communication from the co-chairs of the subcommittees where we had identified potentially areas of overlap. And I'll just state that perhaps when we all dug into it, that those areas where perhaps overlap was perceived to exist, actually, as we dug in, really, it felt like everybody had a understanding and a recognition of the role that each subcommittee would play, in fact, and it was good to call attention and articulate it, but it feels like everybody was really wrapping their mind around the core charges of each subcommittee in the same way. And perhaps the area that I would just say where we weren't able to sort of articulate clear boundaries, perhaps is the word I'll use for what subcommittee is doing what, is the emissions reductions one right at the top. That role and responsibility sits clearly within the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee as the subcommittee that will consider and recognize the strategies and recommendations to meet the statutory requirements for 2025 and beyond. But there is a recognition that the expertise that within how to deal with the ag emissions in particular, which is the largest component of the non-energy emissions, sits within the Ag and Ecosystems Committee. And I'll just say that the task lead for non-energy emissions in cross-sector is Commissioner Walk. and Commissioner Walk sees this as a totally appropriate role where the recommendations for how to reduce ag emissions would be generated within the ag ecosystems subcommittee, recognizing that that will need to feed into the larger framework of recommendations to deal with emissions reductions overall in cross-sector. So while it's not a clear line, cross-sector is clearly in charge of all emissions reductions, but that work will be firmly informed by the role and responsibilities within ag and ecosystems. And everybody feels comfortable and okay with how that can work going forward, I believe. Just recognizing that cross-fertilization will need to happen. Some of these others are just like broad topic areas, just so everybody knows where they're sitting. Sequestration sits firmly within ag and ecosystems. Resiliency, you'll recall that Councillor Erica Borneman sort of brought this up at the council meeting, but when we dug into it deeper, between her and Catherine, the co-chairs of Rural Resilience, and Billy and Abby, the co-chairs of Ag and Ecosystems, there was a clear line with respect to the built environment versus the natural landscape, natural and working landscape of who would be thinking about resiliency and adaptation in which sectors and which areas. Recognizing that natural infrastructure will certainly have overlap in both committees, but that there's a clear line between resiliency of the built landscape and resiliency of our natural and working lands within ag and ecosystems. The other one that I'll just highlight finally is a recognition that public engagement is going to be spearheaded and led by Just Transitions, and that's with respect to the thought process behind the framework and tools that will be employed and deployed, I should say, to other subcommittees to use for public engagement. But that doesn't mean that public engagement will only happen from Just Transitions. They'll be spearheading what that looks like with input and engagement from the other subcommittees as public engagement starts to happen on the ground. And then finally, just technical analysis. We're starting to see the benefits of having a science and data subcommittee, which is really great. Really sitting there and thinking about how we advance the science and understanding behind the climate action plan. And that will sit firmly within science and data, recognizing that cross-sector mitigation will have a role in thinking about what the modeling looks like, being a player for the test runs of the data that comes out of that, as well as ag and ecosystems, who will be thinking a lot about the methodology for the carbon budget, which is a big component of the technical, one of the big components of the work that will get under contract. And then just recognizing that will think about how science and data reaches out and supports the science and data needs of all of the other committees. And science and data is thinking about liaisons the same way Just Transitions is thinking about it, informing the work of other subcommittees and having a regular presence with other subcommittees going forward. So this is just sort of a simple chart that I put atop of the subcommittee charges. And hopefully, I think that this, and I encourage Lauren, Jared, others who sit on subcommittees to speak up if you feel like I haven't characterized the roles and responsibilities of your subcommittees correctly, but also feel like perhaps that perceived conflict or tension of who was doing what that felt visible at the Climate Council meeting. Really, once we dug into it, I feel like everybody has a clear understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are for each subcommittee going forward. And it feels like we're starting out on a good path forward on who's doing what.
Super. Thanks, Jane.
You're welcome.
Okay. Reactions? Points of clarity? Did Jane nail it?
Go ahead, Jared.
Jared, go ahead.
I just want to say I think that this looks great. Clearly, there's not always going to be, that there's going to be overlap, and it's not always going to be black and white where one responsibility ends and another begins. But I think this is a really good kind of reference point and framework. And I want to go to what Lauren said in a previous steering committee meeting, is that there may be some tasks that happen under these broad topic areas where there's like a task group that gets assigned to it that would involve members of different subcommittees. So for instance, if we're looking at the kind of how we assess carbon sequestration, I can imagine kind of a task team that would include folks from ag and ecosystems and science and data. But I think in terms of just like a who's on first or who's the task lead, this is a really helpful and sensible approach to me. And thank you, Jane, for taking the time to put this together.
Just to respond to that, I haven't really actually clearly thought about that with respect to sequestration, and because I've done a job of trying to respect where there's some overlap or input from other committees, I'll try to make note of that in the description for that going forward. So thanks, because I agree with you on that.
Great. Anything else on this, Secretary Young? Hang on a second. I think you're on mute if you're talking.
I just want to say thank you. This is really good news from my perspective. It feels like folks have started to kind of settle in and dig in and realize, you know, that there are some natural boundaries between the work that they're doing, to use that term, but also some good collaboration went on to develop this. So, you know, I think folks felt a little bit at sea the last time we met, and it sounds like we're settling in, and I hope that's an accurate assessment.
Great. Feels like, doesn't it? Okay. And anything else on this? Great. Okay, let me stop sharing. And okay, great. Now, this is the conversation I've most been looking forward to. Let's see how it goes. And this is the conversation about trying to get our hands around December 1st Climate Action Plan deliverable, and what it is, what it isn't, how well we are responding to the statutory requirement, and how well we're responding to a sense of just sheer reality of what can get done and what can't get done. So Jane, you've put together a draft table of contents as a pathway into this conversation about what December 1st is and how we want to frame it up. And so I'll let you walk us through that. And know that where we want to go with this conversation is, what is this? How do we understand how far we're going to get by December 1st? And are we sure we're in a good place in terms of our statutory requirements, and a good place in terms of what's realistic? So Jane, I turn it over to you, please.
Thanks. And I noticed I said to David on the agenda, like, that it was highlighted as sort of coming to consensus or agreement on this outline. And I think this is just the start of a conversation. I don't pretend in any way to have gotten this initial outline correct, but it's, you know, struggling with the recognition, as David just suggested, of what we can do and what we're required to do by the statute, and coming to an agreement on those 2 points in particular in the coming weeks will be really important to inform and guide the work of the subcommittees. So, you know, the beginning part of this outline is sort of, you know, taken straight from some other climate action plans, and thinking about sort of just the nuts and bolts of some of the components that we'll want to have in the plan, you know, a recognition of the governor, the co-chairs, a summary, the requirements, and then leading, before we dive into what the recommendations and strategies are, setting a tone around how the plan was developed with respect to the vision and guiding principles that Just Transitions are developing now as sort of the grounding and underpinning of how we informed our strategies and recommendations to consider impacts in Vermont. And then this is where I think I really want to tease up and think about the conversation today at a couple different levels. First and foremost, I want to suggest that where I'm struggling and look for all of you to help with input is how we think about sort of the three buckets of work that we're kind of working on. The greenhouse gas reductions, and what I think I have here is how that would look. but then how do we fold in the resiliency work and perhaps the sequestration work that may be on a longer, may not have as much of a firm deadline on what's required of that in the December 1st plan? Is that like, is this sort of like one chunk of the plan and then we move to step 2, step 3, which is resiliency and sequestration, or are they all embedded? And I'll just say that what I've noticed from other states is it feels like there are a couple of different paths. Like Maine doesn't separate out any of that. It's also more general than I think we need to get to. So the strategies and recommendations include greenhouse gas emission reduction recommendations, but also have embedded all together the sequestration work and the resiliency work. In California, though, there's 3 separate plans for each of those components of their law. So it's not as embedded, and it's not embedded at all. It's all separate. So the other thing that, in addition to thinking broadly about the areas of interest that we're thinking about for this plan, is we're thinking about how to frame what I've heard from all of you in really nice packages, sort of the blueprint for 2025, the strategies for 30, and perhaps the vision for 50. And we're going to discuss if that's an accurate reflection or not. But another way to think about that would be, rather than sort of backing off on level of specificity by year, would be teeing up sort of what we can present as fully baked, fully ready recommendations and strategies for 2025, or I should say in this first plan, and ensure that those fully baked strategies and recommendations add up to what we need to get to for 2025 with respect to reductions. And then sort of tease out a separate category that articulates what are some other strategies and recommendations that we know some suite of are going to need to be part of the next climate action plan or an iterative process, and what are the recommendations that we need to be looking at to further refine those as we move towards the next climate action plan for, I guess, 2025 would be the next time it would be due, mindful that it could come sooner. And then, of course, understanding that there's all the specificity that we will have to have in this plan that, like, Maine didn't have to get to, around what are the rules that we immediately need to implement, where is the funding and financing options, what are the policy recommendations, and then really thinking about the further art, research and development work that we need to do to sort of refine those other strategies and recommendations to get them to a point of prime time, sort of. So this is sort of the meat of where we're like have to come to agreement on what how detailed we have to get to for December 1st and what's required of us of the statute. And then also think about how we want to tease up a framework for presenting sort of what we are able to produce by December 1st and what we aren't able to produce by December 1st, but will need to be major components going forward of the climate action plan. So hopefully I've done an okay job setting that up, and encourage you all to and think of David's way to suggest how we advance this conversation today.
Super. Thanks, Jane. I saw some hands go up, so let's start there and see how people are reacting. So Jared, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Thanks, David. And thank you, Jane. This is a really great start with a lot of good content in here. I have 2 immediate reactions, and I'm happy to also provide more detailed, feedback, so we're not getting into wordsmithing on this call. But the 2 higher level pieces are, one, I think that 2025 and 2030 are more like targets than 2030 and 2050. Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to see 2030 moved up either with 2025 or separate from 2050. And one of the reasons I say that is I'm just thinking about the timelines that we're working with in terms of, when we make a recommendation in December, either it'll go through real rulemaking or it'll go through a legislative process. And there's, that deliberation, there's the passage of it, then there's the implementation of it, and then there's the delayed effect. And so I do think that, given that, some of the things that we recommend may not end up having direct impacts on reducing emissions, a few years out potentially, it's important to foreground some of the 2030 strategies with more specificity than we would the 2050 ones. And whether that is kind of putting them up in the 2025 section or having a separate section. It's just something I want to think through a little bit more carefully. The other thing I would say is that I like your the kind of like sub pieces under recommendations, and I'd suggest that we add one after action type and before cost and funding considerations, and that would be assessment of impacts. I think the degree to which we can say this action, under these assumptions, is likely to reduce emissions by this many million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And also some of the other key assessments in terms of cost effectiveness and equity. So the degree to which we can say, if we pursue this, this is what we think the impact or the net impacts in terms of costs and benefits would be to consumers, the state economy, and health. I think if we can get to some kind of consistent way of talking about the expected impacts of the actions, yes, very clearly on the emissions reduction, so that then we can say, how do these actions then add up to that required emissions reduction, but also in terms of the other things that we care about in terms of cost effectiveness and equity. And some of those we may not be able to put a exact number on, or a number that has the highest degree of confidence depending on where our analysis is with our consultants. But I think that there's a lot of these actions that we would at least be able to speak to in a directional way in terms of what we expect for impacts or some of the key considerations of those. So I'd like to think through how we can add in some of that to the kind of actual structure of the plan and the recommended the recommendations and action types.
Thanks, Jared. That's helpful. Secretary Moore.
Sure. So I had talked to Jane a little bit about this earlier, but one of my questions is just thinking through where the resilience and the sequestration pieces sort of live in this outline. Clearly, the part of the challenge here is that the deadlines are very specific to our greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements, and we don't have the same sorts of deadlines around some of the other components of this work. I think another piece, though, and this was part of the discussion yesterday at the Science and Data Subcommittee, is the strong nexus, or potential nexus at least, between the ag and ecosystems and the sequestration opportunities, net carbon zero, and then thinking about the, kind of the value proposition and being able to make those comparisons with additional greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements once we get to net zero carbon, and just making sure we're sort of being thoughtful about kind of the most impactful work we're able to do overall, and needing those pieces to stay tied together. So just, trying to figure out where we can put some of the sequestration and resilience work in this outline to make sure that it does tack and tie as needed is really important. And then would just build on one of the points Jared made about implementation timelines. And I don't see these as necessarily being that there's going to be a lot of discrete items where we have a heavy emphasis on vehicle electrification that then stops at 2025 and we shift gears and do something else. That these are going to be programs that probably extend over a more significant period of time, and agree with what he was indicating, that there probably isn't a bright line between 2025 and 2030, and there's a blurry line somewhere between 2030 and 2050, and it may make more sense to lump 2030 up with 2025, even if we haven't gotten all the way to the full set of strategies, initiatives, and programs by December 1st for 2030. We should at least be able to show what the program strategies and initiatives we'll be using to reach the 2025 goal will do in terms of our 2030 requirement.
Yeah, thanks. And just before I go to Lauren, what makes me think when I hear you say that, and Jared as well, is I wonder if the structure is about the strategies, and then inside the strategies you say, this is the level of specificity that we can get to, and this is how it will relate to 2025, 2030. This is the level of work that needs, further refinement, right? So it's because it probably this strategy at the top and the strategy at the bottom are going to have very similar, it's going to be electrification. It's going to be, the way we do the heating. So, Lauren?
Yeah, I was going to make a similar recommendation, David, about project or strategy readiness and whether it could be tied to 2025 or 2030, and certainly in agreement with both Secretary Moore and Jared that the 2025 and 2030 recommendations are going to be much more closely aligned than what we would see for 2050, which I think Jane referred to as more of a vision, vice, a blueprint, and a strategy. I do want to, recognizing I'm coming at this from the person supposed to be talking the most about resilience, that I would be really concerned about us siloing these efforts in a way that Jane kind of described California did. I think as we just saw in our previous agenda item, the overlap between the subcommittees is pretty profound. And so to think that we could just tackle climate change by our emissions reductions efforts is pretty short-sighted and would have, I think, pretty significant impacts both to natural hazard concerns if we don't start doing climate adaptation efforts now, as well as, an example is if there's a significant uptick in renewable energy siting, that would have impact potentially on land use conversion and carbon sequestration numbers. So I think insofar as we have these separate subcommittees talking about different buckets of work, that's really the opportunity that each of those can kind of recommend what they see most fit it within sequestration, adaptation, resilience, and beyond, and recommend it up to the full council for consideration. But I just want to make sure that I'm being the appropriate voice for resilience and adaptation, and would hate to see that fall off because of concerns of 2025 deadline.
Nice. Okay. Secretary Young?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great start, and I do appreciate the work that's gone into this again, Jane, and I know it's going to evolve as we all get a chance to digest it and put it into action as committees start to do the work and start to do drafting. I think I like Jared's idea of putting 2030 in a class by itself in between 2025 and 2050, and here's why. I mean, I'm not in the trenches like you are, but I think some of my added value is having listened to the subcommittee chairs at the last council meeting, and the feeling of this is an incredible amount of work to do through 2050 in the short time that we have, and looking for some direction from the steering committee as to how to organize their work and how to not feel overwhelmed by these looming outdates, and there was that suggestion, I think, at our last council meeting about let's look at it in the format of the statute and the goals. So if I'm reading this correctly, I think this may bring the focus and the direction to the subcommittees as they do their work, which is first and foremost, we've got to develop the plan to meet the 2025 emissions and be working towards 30 and 50. We're going to have time to revisit the plan, as often as we like, but at least every, I think it's 4 years, and that will evolve, and we'll get to where we need to be in the plan with more specificity as we get closer to those dates. If I'm misunderstanding that, then I'd love to hear from folks, but this is what I'm seeing as being responsive to those concerns.
Right. I think one of the things that will, having just walked through this with Maine, that gets confusing is when you use words like strategies. Like, what level of detail is a strategy, right? Is a strategy electrification of transportation, right? And then that's really big, and it's going to be important for 2025, 2030, and 2050. Or are you going to a level of specificity underneath that and still calling that a strategy? The reason I bring that up is I have a sneaking suspicion that you're going to have strategies thought of as something broad, like broad categories of actions that you can name as important for now and the future, right? And then you're going to have varying levels of specificity of the actions or the specific programs or things that you would recommend to get to, 2025 for sure, on track for 2030, right? And so that's the specificity, is the shorter timeframes. The reason I just say that because I think sometimes we get muddled up with the word strategy and how defined that is or how specific it is. I'm here. Jared, do you want to build on that?
David, I really appreciate that and really agree with it. One thing, I mean, I'm thinking back to how this may mirror the kind of plan and process we're putting together around the analysis, both what's already happening with the comprehensive energy plan and what we're teeing up for this RFP. And I wonder if there's a way to structure this where we kind of say up front, in order to meet these emissions, and this would just be a piece of it. I very much agree and appreciate with what Lauren said, that we need to not lose sight of the non-mitigation kind of pieces of the act and make sure they're included in here. But specifically speaking to the emissions reduction requirements, I think what we could do is kind of upfront say, in order to meet, especially 2025 and 2030, here is the scale and pace of sectoral change we're going to need to achieve, and these are the measures in terms of technologies, best practices, behavior change, etc., that are likely necessary to add up to those emissions reduction. And I think that's really easy. Those are somewhat easier to characterize. EAN has done a lot of that work. That's also going to be happening by the folks who've been hired by the department, the Public Service Department and ANR to do the LEAP modeling. Once that stage is set in terms of folks having a sense of, okay, we've got to get this scale and pace of emissions reduction from the transportation and thermal sectors and other sectors, et cetera, and here are some of the measures that can achieve that, then I think there's another section that says, okay, these are the policies, the recommended regulations, the kind of actual interventions that are meant to achieve that sectoral change in emissions reduction through those more technical measures. And those to me feel like different types of things to organize in a report and to kind of characterize and discuss.
I think you're onto something, Jared. And I don't know if others have a different view. Let's just take another minute or two on this because we do have a few other things to do in our meeting here. Do folks have just pushback on what Jared's talking about or other kinds of comments you'd like to make before we round this up?
I'm going to stop sharing unless anybody has objections.
That's great. I think that's good. Okay, great. So this was a good first step. It got our minds cooking in this, and this is something we're going to have to continue to talk about. And I know we've had some internal conversations that it feels like our steering committee meetings are too short and our council meetings are too long. And so there may be some things that need to be adjusted here because there's work that we need to continue doing here. Okay, so let's finish up what we have on our agenda here. And so we can finish on time, because I know we're going to lose Secretary Young at a hard stop, and most of us too. These other items hopefully are quick. These are specific sort of member items. One is about, we didn't in our process document talk about the use of alternates. And this is a specific case that we have where Kelly's going to go out on maternity leave and was interested in having an alternate sit in from her organization to not lose the thread in the just transitions, and I think in the council. She's going to miss a council meeting as well, I'm not sure. And so that's a specific request, and I think Jane and everyone wanted to just check with you all as a steering committee, sort of, is that work fine on a specific request? And then let's be careful not setting a precedent we don't want to set on this. Secretary Young, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think what Kelly's proposal was that she has someone from her business who would be willing to sit in on the meetings, would not be a voting member of either a subcommittee or the council, if I got that right, Jane. So I think she's really looking for some eyes and ears while she's on her family leave. But you're right. I think we've got to be careful about setting a precedent for more, general desires to have somebody sit in anybody's absence. We're all going to have vacations. We're all going to have a sick day. We're all just going to have to get used to missing, some meetings and catching up. But in Kelly's case, it seemed to make sense. But what I said to her is, I really needed to bring it to the steering committee, especially the legislative appointees, because she is one and there's no clear delegation authority. But I think she's not talking as much about delegation, but more as, a presence there to speak, that will know the interest that Kelly serves, because it's someone that works with her. So I throw that out there.
I see some thumbs up. Sounds good. In terms of the precedent being set, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you, Secretary Young, is like, let's be cautious here. What we would typically do in other processes, we would say, if you are, and this isn't what I'm suggesting you do here necessarily, but if you're going to do this kind of thing, it has to be the same person. It has to be consistent. Because what you don't want is like a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, well, my concern really is that it feels like the committees have come together. They're starting to work together. They know each other, and if we start allowing alternatives to kind of dive in and out because someone might miss one meeting, I think it could be more disruptive to the work than not. That's just and if we start making that an option for everybody for every meeting. I just worry about the committee process and the subcommittee process that you all have set up and seem to have, stabilized and now are getting going on it. So that was one of my concerns.
Chris, do you want to comment on that?
I'm fine with the proposal. I just didn't know, and I'm sure you guys are already thinking about this, just what the rules are governing if this was a legislative appointment, it's not they're appointing the person, not the organization.
That's right.
Like in my case, in some cases I'm appointed to things because I'm staff of a regional planning commission. In this case, I was appointed because I was the person, so I couldn't necessarily have somebody serve in my stead. I'm fine with the proposal because I think we said the person wouldn't be voting or anything like that. So it could even be just Kelly would ask that person to stand as a member of the public. But like I said, I'm fine with it. It's just I'm sure you guys are already thinking about just what are the legal details with a legislative appointee.
Well, I think that's a good point, and which is why I wanted to bring it to the legislative members, because you are appointed as the person, and you don't have, I believe, designation, of the ability to have a legal designee. The other option would be to invite the individual that Kelly has suggested to be a member of your the subcommittee. And that way they're a member of the subcommittee, and we won't get into a legal tangle if there's any objection. And because you can have unlimited numbers on your subcommittees, I believe.
My hope is that we can sort of sidestep the whole legal thing by this person being an observer, being someone who's there to provide some continuity for Kelly. So I think if we posit it that way, we don't need to run into too much trouble. Lauren?
Yeah, I agree with that approach. If the real value add is just kind of continuity for a missed meeting or two, them kind of coming to report back any highlights as a member of the public makes more sense, especially if they're non-voting.
Right. Okay. So if that works, just a quick check-in, does that approach work for everybody in this particular case? Great. Okay. So the other thing, and this is another sort of a little squirrely one, is that Sophia, who is stepping down as a council member, I understand would like to continue on as a subcommittee member. And there was a question mark to bring it to you all. Does that make sense and work for everybody? Jane or whoever has been involved in this conversation, is there anything else to say about that?
Yes, so Sophia's on the call too, so she's welcome to speak up also, but I'll just suggest that my only cautionary tale is also associated with a clear process that was set up for subcommittee members. And we've been very true to that process as we've continued to look outside, like not step outside the nomination process to bring in other folks and expertise. And we've really tried to sort of consider the role and expertise needed on the subcommittee, and therefore what came in through the nomination process. So this is just a little unique, as it's not exactly how we picked members. And so I just felt like it was an unclear, uncharted territory. So I just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah. Jared?
My initial reaction is that I feel like throughout the process, we've done a really good job, or we've strived to defer to the wishes of each subcommittee. So as long as, their recommendations didn't, raise some flags. So I guess I would defer to the subcommittee. And if it's their wish to have Sophia continue, and Sophia wants to continue, I would look to their recommendation, but I haven't been involved in these discussions, so I'd be happy to hear from others who have, and from Sophia.
Right, and I know we're going to lose Secretary Young right now because of a hearing. So is there anything else folks want to say to build on what Jared's saying, essentially like leave it to the subcommittee, let them decide how that works? Does that work for everybody, Lauren?
Yeah, as a member of that subcommittee, I think that would be great. I also, just for this group, as we consider the statutory implications, that Sophia would no longer be a council member and therefore no longer a voting member of the subcommittee. So just for visibility, should we defer to agriculture and ecosystems on that membership status, that would not change voting status.
Right. Okay. Okay. I apologize if some of you need to go. We do want to take a moment to do public comment. And then if there's any final business you all need to do, let's do that. So just let's do a moment of public comment here and see if anybody who's been observing our meeting today would like to chime in. Please just raise your hand, and we'll take a moment and see if there's any comment folks want to do today. This is an opportunity as well, if you'd like to make your comment in the chat, if you'd prefer to do that than saying it verbally. Just give a moment. Again, it's we'll use the hand raise function if you'd like to make a comment. Great, I see Sophia's comment in the chat. Great, wonderful. Okay, so I'm not seeing hands from the public. Thanks for the chat, Sophia. I'm glad you're on this call with us. Okay, Jane, was there one other piece of business you wanted to do real quick around meetings?
I just wanted to flag for a future steering committee meeting the discussion around the length of these meetings and perhaps recognition of the idea of the work of the subcommittees really getting going especially after the next April council meeting, and the consideration perhaps of having bi-weekly council meetings that are perhaps 2 hours in length, and thinking about the role of the council at that point as just, giving AOKs as the subcommittees are moving forward and hearing and digesting information to keep it moving quickly. So I'll table that and bring that up as an idea for the next steering committee meeting.
Right. And would people just in principle be open to like an hour and a half of us? Because it always feels like we're getting to the end. We don't quite have enough time. I know it's a bummer to add more time in the schedule, but I feel like this core group is so critical. So I just want to put that out there, but feel free to message us privately and say, please do not add another half hour to my schedule. Anything else, folks? I think we got to the end here.
This might be obvious, but I just want to flag for our next steering committee meeting, making sure that we discuss the preparation of the council agenda on the 26th, because I think it might creep up on us.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Absolutely. Liz?
Super quick, just on that last point before, on the time of this meeting, extra half an hour, fine with me. You might consider, though, any sort of break at all between cross sector and this one, because I know it's happened to me twice now. Like there's just some things we have to do in between. And I don't mean bio breaks, I mean like a phone call.
Yeah.
So even 15 minutes would be helpful.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah. You're right. It's been happening the last couple times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Well, cross sector only meets bi-weekly, and they meet the 3 hours before the steering committee meeting, so it tends to go long.
Yeah, it makes every other Thursday tough. That's
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
All right, folks. Well, let's see how it goes. And thanks for all the input. Jane's got a lot of work to do here, as usual. We will be in touch at our next meeting, and have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice day.
Yeah, bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.